At 15 minutes past midnight on July 30, 1945, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was steaming on a westerly course at 17 knots, approximately 400 miles east of the Philippines, 300 miles short of her destination at Leyte Gulf. Her captain, Charles Butler McVay III, had given the night watch the standard order to maintain her base course without zigzagging, a decision authorized under the Pacific Fleet's prevailing combat orders for transits in waters that had been declared low risk for submarine activity. The night was overcast with broken cloud and a moderate sea. There was no moon. The ship's lookouts and her surface search radar had reported nothing on the horizon for the entire preceding watch. At 12:15, two Type 95 torpedoes from the Japanese Submarine I submerged on her patrol track at periscope depth, her commander Machitsura Hashimoto having seen the Indianapolis on the surface a few minutes before struck her starboard side, one forward of frame 7 and one in the vicinity of the after engineering spaces. The forward torpedo detonated the bow magazine. The after torpedo flooded the engine rooms. The Indianapolis lost power, lost steering, and lost any chance of buoyancy in less than 4 minutes. She rolled hard to starboard, her bow rose vertically as the stern flooded, and she went down by the bow at 12:27, 12 minutes from the first torpedo strike. Of the 1,196 men aboard, approximately 300 were killed by the initial torpedo strikes or were trapped inside the hull as she sank. Approximately 900 reached the open water, most of them having been on watch or above deck at the moment of attack, some having been blown clear, some having jumped during the sinking. They went into the Pacific in scattered groups across roughly a 4-mile area, in life jackets but without rafts in most cases, in water that was 84 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, in conditions that under normal circumstances would have allowed survival for several days. The men in the water expected rescue within hours. The Pacific Fleet's standing procedure for capital ship transits required intermediate position reports to Fleet headquarters. When a report was not received, an inquiry was supposed to be initiated. When the inquiry could not establish the ship's position, a search was supposed to be ordered. The procedure was not followed. The Indianapolis was not missed. Her arrival window at Leyte came and went. The Pacific Fleet had registered her sailing from Guam and had received no further communication, and the system that should have flagged the silence as a problem failed at 3 separate checkpoints. The men in the water waited, and the night came and went, and the dawn came and there was no aircraft above them and no destroyer on the horizon, and the morning of July 30 became the afternoon, and the afternoon became the night, and the system that should have looked for them did not look for them. What followed in the next 4 days has been documented through the testimony of the 316 men who survived. The water temperature dropped at night to 76 degrees, cold enough to produce hypothermia in men who had no clothing beyond the dungarees and life jackets they had been wearing at the torpedo strike. The sun in the day produced second-degree sunburns on faces and shoulders. Dehydration set in within 24 hours. Drinking seawater, which a fraction of the men resorted to despite the standing Navy training that warned against it, produced salt psychosis and hallucinations within hours. Sharks arrived on the second day. The species was principally the oceanic whitetip, a pelagic shark that hunted by following the wakes of merchant ships and that had been drawn to the Indianapolis's wake before her sinking and then to the bodies in the water afterward. The whitetips circled the floating groups for the next 3 days. They took men one at a time, slowly, principally from the edges of the floating groups. The surviving testimony is consistent that the shark losses were continuous through the daylight hours and continuous through the nights. The Navy's later analysis of recovered remains, conducted at Pearl Harbor, identified shark bites as the immediate cause of death for roughly 150 of the men who had died in the water. The other deaths were attributed to dehydration, exposure, drinking of seawater, and drowning from exhaustion. The total dead in the water was approximately 600. The total survivors recovered alive was 316. The rescue, when it came, was an accident. On the morning of August 2, a Navy PV, Ventura patrol aircraft from Squadron VPB-152, piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn on a routine patrol out of Peleliu, noticed an oil slick below his flight path roughly 200 miles south of his patrol track. Gwynn descended to investigate and saw in the water what he initially took to be a Japanese submarine surfacing, and then, looking more carefully, the heads and shoulders of dozens of men. He radioed Peleliu. The Navy began the recovery operation within hours. A second patrol aircraft, a PBY Catalina under Lieutenant Adrian Marks, landed on the open sea against standing flight orders to recover the most exhausted survivors directly into the aircraft. Marks loaded 56 men into the PBY and held them aboard, with the aircraft no longer airworthy, until the surface vessels arrived. The destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle reached the area at 11:30 p.m. on August 2 and began recovering the larger groups. By dawn on August 3, every survivor had been brought aboard a Navy surface vessel and was receiving medical care. The rescue had begun, by Gwynn's initial sighting, more than 4 days after the sinking. The strategic context of the loss was specific. The Indianapolis had completed, 4 days before her sinking, a high-priority mission for the Manhattan Project. She had departed San Francisco on July 16 carrying, in 2 sealed compartments below the flag bridge, the uranium-235 core of the Little Boy atomic bomb and the bomb's casing and fuse components. She had crossed the Pacific in 10 days at high speed, reaching the U.S. Army Air Force's base on Tinian on July 26. There she had unloaded her cargo into the hands of the Manhattan Project's tactical team, which would deliver the bomb to the B-29 Enola Gay on August 6. The Indianapolis had then proceeded to Guam, picked up routine orders, and departed for Leyte Gulf for crew training and refit, with her secret cargo no longer aboard. She was sunk on a routine voyage. Her loss did not affect the atomic bomb mission. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings proceeded as scheduled. The men in the water knew nothing of the cargo they had carried. Most of them learned only in the weeks following their rescue, when the bombs were announced, that the Indianapolis had been a key piece of the Manhattan Project's transportation chain. Captain McVay survived the sinking. He had been on the bridge at the moment of attack, had been blown overboard, and had spent the 4 days in the water with the rest of his crew. He had emerged from rescue gaunt, sunburned, and unable to walk without assistance. He was returned to the United States in mid-August, and was in November 1945 court-martialed by the U.S. Navy for 2 charges: failure to give timely abandon ship orders and failure to maintain a zigzag course. The first charge was dismissed. The second was upheld. McVay became, in the verdict of his court-martial, the only American naval officer of the Second World War to be convicted in connection with the loss of a ship under his command. The Navy's Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Ernest J. King, signed the conviction order. The court-martial verdict was widely criticized at the time, both within the Navy and in the press, on the grounds that the Indianapolis had been transiting in waters declared low risk, that the standing combat order had authorized the captain's discretion regarding zigzagging in such waters, and that the I-58's torpedo attack had been launched at a range and bearing where zigzagging would not have made a difference. Machitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk the Indianapolis, was brought to the court-martial as a witness for the defense and testified, through a translator, that he could have torpedoed the ship regardless of her course because his attack geometry had been favorable from any approach angle. The court accepted the testimony as accurate but found McVay guilty on the second charge nonetheless. McVay was reduced in rank and reprimanded. He was restored to active duty within months, but his naval career was effectively finished. He retired in 1949 as a rear admiral on the basis of total time in grade and lived in Connecticut for the next 20 years. He received hate mail from the families of the dead crew members through the rest of his life. The letters arrived at his home in modest numbers each year, often around the anniversary of the sinking. McVay kept the letters in a drawer in his study. In November 1968, at the age of 70, McVay went out to a fishing pier on his property in Connecticut, placed a Navy revolver against his head, and shot himself. His suicide was attributed by his family, in post-war correspondence with veterans' organizations, to the cumulative weight of the court-martial conviction and the continuing personal correspondence from the families. The surviving crew members of the Indianapolis, organized into a veterans association after the war, lobbied the U.S. Congress for the formal exoneration of Captain McVay for more than 3 decades. The campaign was supported by Machitsura Hashimoto, who wrote to the U.S. Senate in 1999 from his retirement in Japan as a Shinto priest, urging the United States Senate to clear McVay's name. The U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution in October 2000 exonerating McVay of negligence in the loss of the Indianapolis. The U.S. Navy in 2001 placed in McVay's personnel record a formal memorandum noting the congressional action and confirming the exoneration. The court-martial conviction was not formally vacated. The Navy concluded it could not legally vacate the verdict of a properly convened court-martial, but the official record of McVay's service now carries the exoneration alongside the conviction. The wreck of the Indianapolis was located in August 2017 by a research expedition funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, lying in approximately 18,000 feet of water in the Philippine Sea. The discovery confirmed the position the Navy had estimated for the sinking, identified the damage pattern from the 2 torpedo hits, and put to rest the last operational uncertainty about the sinking's specific circumstances. Allen's expedition placed a memorial plaque at the wreck site on the 80th anniversary of the loss. The procedural failure that produced the 4-day delay deserves a careful description, because the failure is the part of the story that remains operationally instructive. The Indianapolis had sailed from Guam under standard transit orders for the Leyte Gulf Passage. Her expected arrival time at Leyte was the morning of July 31. When she did not arrive, the senior officer at Leyte Gulf, Vice Admiral Lynn D. McCormick's Port Command, was supposed to query the ship's status through the fleet's daily ship tracking system. The system used was a series of routine logs maintained at the port commands of the Pacific Fleet, recording ship arrivals and departures. The Indianapolis's failure to arrive on July 31 was recorded in the Leyte port log without comment. The port officer who maintained the log assumed that the Indianapolis had been diverted to another assignment, as cruisers and capital ships of the Pacific Fleet were routinely diverted to multiple operational requirements. He did not initiate an inquiry to the dispatching command at Guam. The dispatching command at Guam, on its side, had no reason to query Leyte about the Indianapolis's arrival, since the ship had departed on schedule and was assumed to be making her transit normally. The 2 command sides of the transit assumed each other was tracking the ship. Neither was. The institutional failure was not one of intent, but of unstated assumption about responsibility. The Navy's post-war institutional review of the loss identified this specific failure as the principal procedural cause of the 4-day delay. The Pacific Fleet revised its ship tracking procedures within months of the loss, instituting a mandatory daily reporting requirement that any ship not heard from would be flagged for active inquiry within 24 hours. The reform was not popular at the time within the operational fleet, which considered the additional reporting burdensome. It became standard nonetheless. The procedure remained in modified form through the rest of the Pacific War, through the post-war Navy, and into the contemporary U.S. Pacific Fleet's reporting structure. The torpedo that sank the Indianapolis deserves a small note as well. The Type 95 torpedo was the Japanese Navy's standard submarine-launched torpedo of the late war period. It carried a 405-kilogram warhead, ran on pure oxygen fuel that left no surface wake, and had a range of 9,000 meters at 50 knots. It was, by 1945, technically a better submarine torpedo than the American Mark 14 it was facing. The Japanese submarine force had relatively few opportunities to employ the Type 95 to its advantage during the war years, principally because the Imperial Navy's submarine doctrine had committed its boats to fleet engagement tasks rather than to commerce raiding. The I-58's encounter with the Indianapolis was an exception. Machitsura Hashimoto's submarine had been on a patrol track south of the Marianas, looking for American warships transiting to Leyte, when the Indianapolis came across his periscope range at a closing geometry he could not have arranged in advance. He fired 6 torpedoes, 2 hit. His after-action report, recovered after the war from the Imperial Navy's Submarine Command Archives, was a brief and accurate description of the engagement. He had been operating on the patrol track he had been assigned. He had encountered an American heavy cruiser at favorable geometry. He had fired. He had reported a kill. He had returned to base. The encounter was, on his side, an ordinary submarine action. The men who survived the 4 days in the water did not all recover from it. The medical evaluations conducted at Peleliu and at Guam in the days immediately after the rescue identified roughly 40% of the survivors as suffering from severe psychological trauma, what the U.S. Navy Medical Corps in 1945 called combat exhaustion, and what the post-war medical community would come to call post-traumatic stress. The survivors received 28 days of medical leave. They were then returned to active duty for the brief remainder of the war. Most of them were discharged in the autumn of 1945. The Indianapolis Survivors Organization, formed in 1960, included a substantial fraction of members who had been unable to maintain steady employment in the years after the war, and who had experienced significant difficulties with alcohol, marriage, and sleep. The Veterans Administration did not formally recognize their condition as a service-connected disability until the late 1980s. The recognition was gradual and partial. The cost of the 4 days in the water, in the lives of the men who came out of it alive, was carried by the survivors for the rest of their lives. The historical record now treats the survivors with greater respect than the U.S. Navy of 1945 had felt able to extend at the time. The Indianapolis remains, in 2026, the single largest loss of life from a single American naval action in the entire history of the U.S. Navy. Of the 1,196 men aboard at the moment of the torpedo strike, 880 died. The cost was paid by the men in the water across 4 days that the Pacific Fleet's reporting system had not noticed they were in. The Indianapolis Survivors Organization, the Veterans Association, holds an annual reunion at Indianapolis, Indiana on the anniversary of the sinking. The last living survivor died in 2024 at the age of 102. The reunion is now conducted by the surviving families. The cost of the loss is in the record and is carried forward by the families. The lesson of the loss, that the Pacific Fleet's failure to notice the silence is what produced the 4 days in the water, is in the institutional history of the United States Navy, and by every account has not been forgotten in the 80 years since.